Businesses hire people if it's profitable to do so. They don't do it because somebody asks them to. They don't do it because they're of a certain political party. They don't do it because it's the right thing to do. Businesses are in the business of making profit. They hire people if it's profitable to do so. That means that the amount of unemployment in the economy depends upon how much output is being produced. If there's lots of output, that is to say goods and services, if there's lots of output being produced, then we need a whole lot of people employed to produce that output. That means there are not going to be very many people unemployed. If there's not very much output being produced, we don't need as many people employed to produce what little is being produced. There's going to be a whole lot of people without jobs. And the amount of output that's being produced depends upon the total demand, aggregate, adding together, aggregating, depends upon the total demand for output. Once again, a language that comes from the old days, right? So it's called aggregate demand. It's a phrase that comes up in the 1930s. Would it be called aggregate demand today? Probably not. Total? Yeah, it'd probably be called total. But, you know, it's the 1930s language. We're stuck with it. Suck it up. Here you go. Sort of like RSVP, who talks in French anymore. So GDP depends upon aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is C plus I plus G plus X minus IM. What does that mean? It means we're going to take the whole world, we're going to break it into groups of people who buy goods and services so that we can talk about what determines how many goods and services they buy. The C in this equation stands for consumption spending. Consumption spending is spending by households, that's you and me, for final goods and services. So it includes things like donuts and diapers. It includes things like doctor services and lawyer services. It includes housing expenses. So purchases of final goods and services. So that's spending by households, families. I stands for investment spending. Investment spending is spending by businesses for new equipment. So buying a table, buying a sewing machine, buying a display case, or construction of buildings. Those buildings can be residential, that is to say houses and apartment buildings, or non-residential, places like what we're in right now. All of these things, incidentally, are measured per year. So this is all spending. They're all annualized data. G is government spending, and this is spending by state, local, or federal government agencies, and it covers both the goods that they purchase and the salaries that they pay. And then exports minus imports. EX is exports. IM is imports. Exports are goods and services produced in the United States but sold to people who live in other countries. It doesn't matter where the sale takes place. What matters is where the good or service is produced and who's purchasing it. So we can export California wine by shipping the bottle of wine to Mexico, and somebody in Mexico buys the bottle of wine. Or we can export a bottle of California Chardonnay by somebody from Mexico coming to the Napa Valley and buying the bottle of wine in the Napa Valley. What matters is where it was produced in California and who's purchasing it, somebody who's a Mexican resident. Imports are goods and services that are produced in other countries and purchased by residents of the United States. It doesn't matter where the transaction takes place. So if you buy a bottle of Italian wine at the package store, that's an import of Italian wine. If you go to Rome and you have a bottle of wine with dinner, that's an import of a bottle of wine. Okay, so what matters is where it's produced and who's purchasing it. There's a lot of slop that comes in, particularly with those sorts of tourism purchases. They all get sort of put under the tourism category, but that's how they're tracking things. So they're tracking things through your credit card slips and through your ATM withdrawals, through the declarations at customs as to what you, because at customs you're supposed to declare what you're taking out of the country with you and also how much money you brought in. So since the total amount of output that's produced depends upon how much folks want to buy, those folks being households, businesses, government, and the rest of the world, so this is, we can say, by the rest of the world, ROW. Since how much output is produced depends upon how much total or aggregate demand there is from households, businesses, governments, and the rest of the world. If there's an increase in aggregate demand, there's going to be more output produced, more people are going to have jobs, there's going to be less unemployment. If there's a decrease in aggregate demand, less output's going to be produced, fewer people are going to have jobs, there's going to be an increase in unemployment. And so if we really want to understand why sometimes the unemployment rate is 3% and sometimes it's 9% and sometimes, oh my God, it's 25%, we need to get a handle on the determinants of aggregate demand, on why sometimes consumption is really high and sometimes it's really low, why investment could be high or low, and so on. So then we look at these determinants of aggregate demand. Consumption spending in general depends upon disposable income, or you can think of it as take-home pay. For people who are teaching macro and have to teach the national income accounting, it's not exactly the same, but it's damn close. And take-home pay is a concept that most people have a notion of, and disposable income is like, So disposable income, wealth. So is Donald Trump still wealthy? I think so. Donald Trump is going to spend more per year than I do, even if we were to have the same salary per year, because he's got a heck of a lot more wealth. Interest rates might matter, they might not. Higher interest rates make people save more because they can get a higher return on their saving. And spend less. Higher interest rates make people not want to buy goods like cars that they have to pay interest to buy. On the other hand, higher interest rates, for people who are living off fixed incomes, higher interest rates mean they have a whole lot more money to spend in any given year. Okay? So interest rates mean for people who are living off the earnings of their wealth, they have a whole lot more that they can spend, and so higher interest rates are going to make some people spend more. So you have this interest rates on the one hand make one group of people spend less, make another group of people spend more. How it washes out depends upon your mix of people between folks who are retired and living off their savings and folks who are young and borrowing. And so that's why we say maybe, maybe not. Confidence and expectations for the future. So the more confident you are in the future, the more likely you are to spend, the less likely you are to save. Your expectations of income in the future. If you're sitting here thinking, I just got a pink slip, I don't know if I'm going to get renewed in the fall. If you're sitting here not sure whether or not you're going to have a job in the fall, you're not sitting here because you're not spending the money this summer to travel to Boston. So your confidence about your expectations about your future income determine how much you're willing to spend today. Investment spending, spending by businesses for machinery and buildings. Investment spending depends upon interest rates. Interest rates are really important. Here's an example of Mary buying Dolly's display case. If Mary expects to have a rate of return on those display cases of 8%, let's say, she'd be willing to borrow at up to 8% in order to buy those display cases, but she's not willing to pay more than 8% to buy those display cases. So the higher interest rates go, the fewer businesses are willing to borrow in order to buy machinery or construct new buildings, because there's just going to be fewer projects that are profitable at those higher interest rates. So high interest rates tend to depress investment spending. Low interest rates tend to encourage investment spending. All else constant. All else constant. So don't, what your students will do, but we've got really low interest rates now and businesses aren't borrowing and aren't investing. Well, that's because you're changing two things at the same time, right? So if you hold constant the expected profitability and the availability of funds, higher interest rates are going to decrease investment spending. Lower interest rates are going to increase investment spending. If you decrease the interest rates and at the same time you decrease the expected profitability of these projects, then you're going to have a different result. So you're always looking at changing one thing at a time. Ceteris paribus or all else constant. Okay. Availability of funds, not in a standard list, clearly relevant after the crisis of 2008. So if the lending institutions are unwilling to lend, even though there are profitable projects out there, then there's going to be less investment spending. If they have standard, reasonable availability of funds, then this is not going to bind one way or the other. Expected profitability of projects, the more profitable businesses expect their businesses to be, that was a terrible sentence, the more investment spending there'll be, the lower the profitability, all else constant, then there's just going to be less investment spending. So at a 6% interest rate, Mary was willing to buy Dolly's display cases because she expected to have an 8% rate of return on those display cases. If business advisor came back in and said, oh my God, I did that totally wrong and I slipped a zero, I moved a decimal point in the wrong place, I'm really sorry. I'm so sorry. And it's not an 8% rate of return, it's actually only a 4% rate of return. She's no longer willing to borrow at 6%. So a change in the expected profitability because you've got a bad accountant, or a change in expected profitability because nobody's coming into the pet store anymore. That's going to change investment spending. The other two pieces were government spending and exports and imports. Exports and imports, really small part of the story. You're not going to spend any time on it. Government spending is going to come back in, but we don't have stories. If you take public choice courses, you have stories about what determines government spending. We're not going to do that. We're just going to take government spending as something that's determined outside the model. All right, distribution of aggregate spending, 1930 to 2010. Consumption spending is about 2/3. So when they talk about consumers are 2/3 of the economy, consumption spending is 2/3. It really matters what consumers do. This is the picture that's in people's head. So that total of aggregate demand, 65 to 70% of the total is consumption spending, and that's been true throughout the post-World War II period. Around 20% is government spending, federal, state, and local. 15 to 20% is investment spending. Net exports are negative. That means we import more than we export. The green, the whatever that is, the purple and the red, what's called brown, those things add up to 100%. So when I put these down on a chart, you've got 70 plus 20 plus 15 is 105, and I always get a kid who's like, oh, Professor, that must be wrong. It adds up to more than 100%. It's like, yeah, and here's the negative 5% that makes it add up to 100%. So two things I think to pick out of this. One is consumption spending matters a lot. So the family's choice thing you did, a lot of that spending that you were talking about was consumption spending. And when we talk about multiplier processes, everybody's spending is somebody else's income, which determines their spending and so on. We're really focusing on this green line, on the consumption spending part. The other thing to notice is which line is going the most, which line fluctuates the most. Investment spending. That the one that changes the most, right, the most fluctuations come here in investment spending. Talk about investment spending as the tail that wags the dog. So those changes in investment spending are going to have a big effect. Here, let's get to the 1930s. Great Depression of the 1930s. When we talk about the 1930s, of course, we've got recessions and recoveries. We've got a decade, but there's what they call the double dip. So let me draw a picture here. This is GDP, or output, on the vertical axis, and this is time on the horizontal axis. When you figure over time, output goes up, it hits some peak, it comes down, it goes back up, maybe it hits another peak. So that top there is the peak. That bottom is called the trough. The period between the peak and the trough, so this part here, is called recession. And the period after the trough is called recovery. It's really important to know that when the economy is in recovery, the economy is not recovered, right? So the economy is in recovery once we pass the trough. So the recession is every quarter is worse than the quarter before. Every month is worse than the month before. And then we hit the bottom, and then we start to go back up. The economy, you wouldn't say the economy is recovered, past tense, you wouldn't call the economy recovered until either you reach the previous peak. So you might say the economy is recovered when you get to this point, and you get back to the previous peak amount of output, and then you might say, okay, we've been recovering and now we're fully recovered. Or you might say, look, there was some upward trend there. I'm not going to say the economy is recovered until it gets back to the trend line. Lots of people got very upset, right, in 2009 when they said the recession's over. Because they're like, oh my God, how can you say the recession's over? It's like saying surgery's over, right? I mean, when you get rolled out of surgery and into the recovery room, you feel like dancing? No. Surgery's over, right? Surgery's over. They're in the recovery room. You're in the recovery room. You feel like crap, right? You're not back to baseline yet. You got a whole lot of, you're going to stay in the hospital a few days, and then you got like months of PT to go until you're, or OT or whatever it is that you're needing to do, until you get back to feeling to baseline.
That's a great analogy.
Thank you. I don't know if it works for the kids, you know, because I don't know if they have enough experience in hospitals. Yeah, to work for the kids. But it certainly works for us, and it certainly works for those of us who are caring for older parents, right? Because, you know, like at some point with your parents, they never actually get back to baseline. Yeah. So, okay. All right. So we were in a recession from August of 29 through March of 1933. That's when the economy hit bottom. The economy is starting to improve from March of 33 through May of 37, and then it turns down again. So there's a second, they call it the double dip, because we had not fully recovered. So it's a double dip if you haven't fully recovered before the second downturn begins. It's just a second, it's a later recession if you've fully recovered, and then later on there's another recession. So this double dip is not yet back to this baseline, and then things turn around and go back down. And then June 38 to December 41, the second recovery. We ended at December 41 because by then we're back to whatever kind of baseline you want to draw. So we're back to extraordinarily low unemployment. The amount of output that's being produced is really high. We're back on the trend line and so on. Graphs. Real GDP from 1900 to 2011. Because this goes all the way to 2011, where you can really pick out the last few years. Why didn't I update this to 2014? Because I forgot. It would look similar. So here starts the recession. There's the trough. There's the recovery. There's the second, the double dip. And then here we're fully recovered because we're back to the trend line. The gold line is the trend. The blue line is the actual. If you look at 1900 and 1941, so we're just going to blow up the left third of that graph. So you're getting here real GDP in the blue, real GDP per person in the gold, and again you see the same thing. And then it really, because I just chopped it off at 41, you can really see the drop. It's a 33% drop in real output over that 4-year period, which is huge. We actually weren't gathering unemployment data back in the 20s and the 30s, and so these estimates of unemployment are subsequently put together. So using the same methodology that's been used since 1947 to estimate the unemployment rate, going back, gathering what data that we had for the pre-1947 period and coming up with some estimates. And so even though the numbers are reported with data behind the decimal point to the tenths, I wouldn't believe it. I would take these as, round them up. So I'm not going to worry about whether it's 8.9 or 8.8 or 9.4. So what do we know? We know that unemployment would fluctuate. We know that there was a spike in unemployment in 1920-21, so it's a post-World War I adjustment period. We know there was really low unemployment in the 1920s. And then we know unemployment shot through the roof. Reaches a peak of 25% in 1933. That's an average for the whole year. It must have been higher than 25% in March of 1933 when things started to turn around. Unemployment rate stays really high. So one of the critiques of these numbers is that those numbers treat the people who are working, for instance, for the CCC as unemployed. If you did the alternative and treat the people who are working for the CCC as employed, these numbers change a little bit. They're a little bit lower. It still sucks. Okay. And as awful as 2007, 2009 was, look at the contrast. Right? So we had an unemployment rate that peaked at around 10% in early 2009. Very different than the experience in the Great Depression. Prices fell about 1/3, so there's massive deflation. A lot of times the kids will think, oh, that's cool. Prices go down. Remember that when prices go down, wages go down too. And so if people are selling goods for less, they're going to pay their workers less. Financial sector was hit pretty hard, so the stock market peaks in September of 29. There's the two crashes that we often teach about, crashes in October 24 and October 29. The S&P does not get back to its 1929 peak until 1951. I had students in 2000, 2001 who were like, oh my God, Professor Olney, why aren't you in the stock market? Oh, you should see what the stock market is doing. I'm like, maybe because I teach economic history and I know when there was a bubble in 1929 that it took until 1951 to get back to that level. Non-farm foreclosures were up and peaked in 1933. Farm foreclosures are up as well. There's a story that we tell about farm foreclosures. A lot of farm debt that had been taken on, particularly with World War I. Farmers were encouraged to move to a single crop system, encouraged to take on a lot of debt. However, after the war, prices of farm agricultural goods never came back to their 1913 levels. Farmers are left with lots of debt, can't pay the debt, wind up with foreclosure. The top picture is the second half of the 1920s. The bottom picture is 1931 to 1940. And so it just shows you where these foreclosures are. Farm foreclosures are, here's 1929, are rising, peak in 1933. Bank runs. I showed you this picture the other day. I want to reemphasize it. Here's the peak number of banks is in 1920. It's not 1930. So the period of the 1920s is already a pretty sharp decline in the number of banks. There's a lot of bank failures that happened in the 1920s. That's related to these pictures here. So the darkest states are the ones with the highest level of farm foreclosures. These gray states are the ones sort of in the middle in terms of the share of farm foreclosures. Remember that one of the reasons to be a state bank charter instead of a national bank charter was because of the ability to make real estate loans. National banks were prohibited from making loans on real estate, so these farmers who were borrowing and using their farms as collateral were getting those loans from state chartered banks and not from national banks. And so when all of these farm foreclosures start in the 1920s as a result of the overexpansion of debt with World War I, what's getting hit are the state banks, where you see this sharp decline in the 1920s, and not the national banks, where you see very little decline in the 1920s. The state banks have made lots of loans to farmers. The farmers can't pay. The banks wind up with loans on their books that aren't worth anything. The banks wind up collapsing as well. The runs, where one bank closes and everybody panics and they think that's going to mean their bank is going to close, and so they go and they withdraw their funds, which screws up a fractional reserve banking system. The runs, those are the things that are characteristic of the 1930s, and that's what pulls down these national banks. Interest rates, which matter for investment spending, and we're not sure what they do to consumption spending. Interest rates are moving every which way. So it's hard to say interest rates are going up or interest rates are going down or interest rates are going sideways, because the interest rates on government bonds are stable. The interest rates on prime commercial paper, which is what is paid by the best business customers, those are going down. And the interest rates on BAA, which is the relatively risky borrowers, those are going up. The lenders wanted a higher risk premium. They wanted a higher bonus for having lent to risky customers. If you could find a really safe customer, you were going to try to lend to them and to seduce them into borrowing. You were going to have lower interest rates and the government rates on the table. One of the things that this doesn't reflect, though, is there's an awful lot of businesses that are moving out of the prime category and into the BAA category. So there's many more businesses are risky by 1932-33 than was the case in 1929. Okay, so components of total output aggregate demand. The data we actually have for this early period is GMP instead of GDP. Don't worry about the difference. It's close enough that it doesn't matter for our purposes. This chart is saying, let me take the first one. It's saying in 1921 that percentage change, deltas for change, the percentage change in real output, so the total amount of goods and services that are produced, was 2.4% lower in 1921 than it had been in 1920. So there's a 2.4% drop in total output in 1921 compared with the previous year. If I want to figure out, are we producing fewer consumer goods? Are we producing fewer investment goods? Are we producing less for the government? What is it that we're not producing as much of? Because we're producing 2.4% less. These next columns give me that answer. So let me skip this column for a minute. Inventory investment. So that's producing goods and putting them into inventory. 256% means the drop in inventory investment, goods that are being produced for inventory, was actually 2.5 times as big as the total drop in output. So it over-explains what was going on. The fixed investment, that's the buildings and machines, 51%. The drop in production of business machinery and equipment is half as big as the total drop in GNP. So it explains half of the drop. What share of it is due to this? So 2.5 times, 256%, is due to inventory. Half of it is due to investment. Around 40% is due to a drop in net exports. What do the negative signs mean? The negative signs mean those components were working against the drop. So the fact that there's a negative sign here in front of consumption tells me that consumption spending was actually going up when the whole economy was going down. So consumption spending was helping to sustain the economy. If consumption spending hadn't been rising from 1920 to 1921, the drop in total output would have been even greater. Contrast that with the 1930s, and look here at this consumption column. But in the 1920 recession, and also in that second dip, in the 1920 recession, consumption is working against the grain. So consumption spending, what households are doing, is helping to sustain the economy. But in 1930 to 1933, consumption spending explains half or so of the drop in output. We need to talk about what consumers are doing in the 1930s to understand the Great Depression. Investment spending, a huge inventory investment. So producing goods to just have an inventory to hope to sell in the future, huge part of what happened in 1921, not terribly relevant in the 1930s. So we don't really have to spend any time talking about inventory investment for the 1930s. Fixed investment, here's your buildings and machines. Pretty substantial part of understanding what's going on the first couple of years of the Great Depression. Not so big in the latter part of the Great Depression. So we need to talk about investment spending, but we don't want to focus only on investment spending. Net exports, 2619. That's why we don't worry about net exports. So I know that you have to teach the Smoot-Hawley tariff. I know you have to talk about all that stuff. But if we're talking about what's really causing these drops, here's 1932. 16% drop in how much output is being produced. 1% of that drop is due to net exports. I'm not going to take, that means you should spend 1% of your time talking about net exports. And I know that Smoot-Hawley tariff is a bigger part than 1% of your time in terms of what the standards are that you'll have to teach, but there you go, right? So that's why we don't spend much time talking about things like Smoot-Hawley, because it's just not, it's not theirs. Negative over here for government. So in the first 2 years of the Depression, government spending is working against the decline. Actually, so which is to say government spending is helping to sustain the economy. They're not cutting government spending. But here, 32, 33, cuts in government spending are a little bit, again, not very big numbers, right, are making things a little bit worse. So to understand the worst years, these 3 years, the worst years, we got to talk about consumption spending, and we got to talk about investment spending. More 3 research questions. So when we talked about the Great Depression, we've got 3 questions. Why the downturn initially? Why was it so severe? So why did we get to 25 instead of, say, 8% unemployment in 1933? And then why did the recovery take so long? Those are the 3 questions. First question's pretty straightforward. It's due to the drop in investment spending. So why the economy turns in the first place is a drop in investment spending. It has to do with the Fed increasing interest rates. It has to do with residential overbuilding. So higher interest rates in January 1928 starts to slow down investment spending, because if Mary's having to pay 10% instead of 7% to borrow to buy her display cases, she's not going to buy as many display cases. Accelerator effect, the notion there is that if Mary's sales at her pet shop are increasing by 10% per year, she's going to have to expand her pet shop a certain amount each year and increase the number of display cases and cash registers and other things that she's got going in the pet shop at a certain rate. If instead her sales start increasing by only, say, 2% per year, her sales are still growing up, so there's still an increase in how much business she's doing in each year, but it's not going up as quickly, and so she doesn't have to expand her number of display cases as quickly, and so what she's spending on display cases goes down. So we're still seeing an increase in sales, but sales are increasing at a slower rate, 2% instead of 10%. And so there's fewer purchases of machines, less construction of buildings in any given year. So you get the economy increasing at a slower rate. It slows down investment spending. Third piece, residential investment declines. We peaked in terms of housing starts in 1926. And then what it really is that there was immigration policy that was passed in 21 and 24 that severely restricted immigration, which very severely slowed down the rate of household formation. And the builders, no builder is going to say, oh, Congress just passed this really restrictive immigration policy. I should cut back on how many houses I'm building, because God knows I didn't want my houses. I have better houses than anybody else. And in the aggregate, you get way too many houses. The 1940s story that comes out of the early Keynesian model is insufficient aggregate demand, so there's something wrong with CIG net exports. CIG net exports is lower, right? So there's insufficient, the aggregate demand is insufficient to keep the economy fully employed. It's kind of a duh at this point. But because it was a new way of thinking about the macroeconomy as opposed to one that was based on supply and demand of labor, it was a big whoop to do in the 1940s. The story at that point went, look, investment spending fell. We knew that. That kicked off multiplier effects because everybody's spending as somebody else's income, and when people have less income, they spend less, and so consumption fell. Expansionary fiscal policy would have helped but wasn't tried, and therefore couldn't save the day. And the policy implications of this was that having expansionary fiscal policy would have been vital to have preventing the 25%. So we could have had only 10% unemployment if we'd had a more expansionary fiscal policy. That was the predominant line of thought, 1940s and 1950s. The 1960s, I have to go through this part real quickly, Milton Friedman becomes very well known and does a lot of work on money. And so he puts forth the monetary hypothesis, or the money hypothesis, based on work that Friedman and Schwartz are doing. So there is this theory that economists have that say if there's more money in the economy, prices are higher. If there's less money in the economy, prices are lower. There's a lot of problems with that. You have to have a whole bunch of assumptions that are satisfied in order for it to work, and those assumptions generally are not satisfied when you're looking at year-to-year changes. But what Friedman wanted us to focus on was this link between money, and he wanted us to focus not on the link between money and prices, but the link between money and output. His argument was relatively subtle. He said the amount of money in the economy fell because banks were creating less money because they were making fewer loans. So because of the bank failures, there was less money in the economy. That the Fed could have prevented that drop in money supply if the Fed had really lowered interest rates, and that would have encouraged banks to make more loans. And that the Fed could have increased the amount of reserves that the banks had, which is, remember, the reserves are what allow the banks to make loans. And that if the Fed had done all of these things, that would have been called expansionary monetary policy, and that would have saved the day. The kicker is that the Fed can't force banks to lend, and we've certainly seen that now, right, over the last 4 years. And now we actually have some recent empirical evidence that backs up the critique. The Fed can pump reserves until the cows come home, but it takes bankers finding somebody they're willing to lend to get the economic activity going in the economy. So there we've got the 1940s and 50s. We've got this emphasis on aggregate demand. We're talking about investment falling. We're talking about multiplier effects on the consumption side. We've got Milton Friedman with the money hypothesis, but it's really based on this implicit assumption that banks are going to lend all of the reserves they've got, which has always been kind of a dicey assumption, and the last 5 years have shown that it's not a terribly good assumption in a crisis. Initially, what happened was a lot of economic historians, when they were trying to understand the Great Depression, they really focused on that decline in investment. Because the story I told you in the 1940s version, I said investment fell, and I didn't say why. I just said investment fell. So a story that a lot of people think carries a lot of weight and has had a big influence on monetary policy in the last, since the crisis, is what we call credit intermediation. It's from work with Ben Bernanke. Ben Bernanke's take on the Great Depression is that what the bank failures do is the bank failures lead to a loss of what he calls credit intermediation, particularly for small businesses. So you think about who borrows from a bank. 1930s today, the people who are borrowing in banks are not the U.S. Steels, right? U.S. Steel's not borrowing in the bank. They're borrowing on the open market. It's Mary's Pet Shop and Dolly's display case, the little small businesses that are going down and borrowing from the bank. The more Mary knows Lisa, the banker, the easier it's going to be for Mary to get a loan from Lisa. Okay, that's good. Now what happens? Well, Lisa's bank was fine, but down the street from Lisa was Michelle's bank, and Michelle's bank failed. And so all of Lisa's customers panicked and ran to Lisa's bank to demand their funds. Fractional reserve banking, can she pay out all of that? No, can't. There's no FDIC at this point. Her bank fails. Right? Her bank fails. Lisa's out of work. Mary, where are you going to go to get a loan? She can't go to Lisa anymore that she's had this relationship with for 10 years. So the bank failures lead to this loss of credit intermediation for the small businesses. So the small businesses are the ones that are really screwed when the banks fail, because they had those personal relationships with their bankers that were enabling them to get credit. Lisa's no longer in the banking business. Mary's shopping around for someplace else to borrow. She goes to Jeremy. Jeremy's like, I don't know this woman. She's trying to sell what? Pet food? She needs display cases for pet food? So she can't get loans as easily anymore. Decreases the amount of lending, decreases the amount of investment. Explains the drop in investment spending. This is why for Bernanke it was so important to save the banks, right? So if you think about monetary policy 2008-2009, Lehman goes down, but why do they care so much about saving the banks? This is what's behind the desire to save the banks, because the belief that the banks, that the big things like Lehman are funding the big businesses like U.S. Steel that can go out in the open market, and that's just, that Lehman's just like a broker for them, and any broker can do that because they're borrowing on the open market. But for the banks, the bankers are important for the small businesses, because that's where the small businesses are getting their loans. And so we want to save the banks, not because we want to save, because we have this fondness in our heart for bankers, but because we believe that banks are a critical part of the credit system, and that losing the banks, you lose these intangibles. Another story about the investment decline has to do with gold standard rigidity. So this is work that's been done by my colleague Barry Eichengreen. Talks about the fact that lots of countries were on the gold standard. In order to maintain a gold standard, you can't have a lot of gold flowing between countries because it screws up the exchange rates when they're all on a gold standard. In order to prevent those gold flows, we have to allow the central bank to manipulate interest rates in a certain way. And because of what else was happening, that required the United States to keep interest rates high. It takes me a full half an hour to explain all of that in detail. So just that's all I'm going to give you. Is because of the gold standard, the Fed was required to keep interest rates high. And so when the Fed should have been lowering interest rates, they instead were jacking up interest rates, and that, again, sucker punched the economy. What's fun about the story about small businesses and the banks is it's very intuitive. What's hard about it is the lack of evidence, right? So what you kind of need is you need to find, did Lisa wind up working as a banker at the new bank down the street, in which case there's no loss of credit intermediation? Were the small businesses unable to get loans because there's a lot of evidence you'd want to gather to support Bernanke's story. Graduate students have been sort of scouring archival records trying to do some of that for 30 years. Consumption decline. Remember the other part of the story was consumption fell a whole lot? The old story was this was all multiplier effects. But then there was work that was done by Peter Temin that showed that the drop in consumption spending was much greater than you would predict given the drop in income. So that there wasn't just people are decreasing their consumption because their income has fallen, but there was something else going on as well. People were cutting back on their consumption more than you would predict given the drops in income and wealth. So now I'm going to give you 3 different stories that look at the drop in consumption. Rick Mishkin's work said, look, if you buy like a car and you need money in a hurry, so you have to sell your car because you're in financial distress, you can do that, but you're going to take a big loss on the car. People are hesitant to put their wealth into things like cars, durable goods, if they anticipate they may have to sell those things in a hurry in order to get the cash out. Right? So the greater the chance that you're going to have to sell that durable good in a hurry to get the cash out, the less likely you are to buy that durable good in the first place. So he talks about that if people are fearing distress sales, they're not going to buy as many durable goods. Well, when do you fear a distress sale? You fear a distress sale if either you have less wealth, so you've drained your, you don't have as many assets, or the value of your wealth has gone down because prices are changing in the wrong direction. Or your liabilities are going up. So something happens to trigger a fear of this distress sale. That's going to make you not want to buy durable goods. And so the implication of this is that people were not buying durable goods. They decreased their demand for durable goods because of this fear that if they bought a car, that they would have to turn around and sell it for a loss. And Adam, this is where the stock market piece comes back in, right? So part of his story is that part of the fear of this distress sale comes from the lowering of the value of stocks. And that as the stock market falls, that lowers the value of people's wealth. You still own 100 shares of stock, but they're not worth anywhere near what they used to be worth, so your wealth has gone down. That makes you more afraid that you might have to sell off some sort of durable good for you to buy it, and that makes you less willing to buy a durable good. The thing is that his story explains the decrease in demand for durables, but doesn't explain why all of those many categories of consumption fell, because it wasn't just durables, right? It was the whole kit and caboodle was falling out. So he's explaining cars and appliances, but he's not explaining a whole lot of other things that went down. Christy Romer looks at the same question, says, okay, it's not just durable goods, but it's things like shoes and clothing as well. So she's going to talk about durable good decisions that are irreversible and semi-durable good decisions as well. Gives a similar story. She's going to focus on uncertainty. She does focus on uncertainty. She focuses on uncertainty, and that people, when they are uncertain about what's coming down in the economy, are just going to say, I don't know what's going on. You know, I've been reading this stuff in the newspapers. I don't understand what's going on. The future's looking pretty uncertain. I'm going to cut back, and I'm just not going to spend as much right now. And it's uncertainty as opposed to an expected drop in income. So she's not saying that people are sitting there saying, oh, I think I'm going to lose my job, and so my expected income goes down. If you think mathematically, there's a mean of a distribution, and there's a bell curve sort of thing around it. She's talking about a widening of that bell curve. So more uncertainty about any particular event is going to make people more hesitant to go out and spend. So less uncertainty, more uncertainty. So less uncertainty makes you more willing to spend, more uncertainty makes you less willing to spend. And she argues that's going to give you, again, a decrease in durable goods spending, a decrease in semi-durables like shoes and clothing, and a shift towards services and non-durables. So she's not actually getting a big drop in consumption. She's getting a remix in her consumption. That people, instead of buying clothing and shoes, are going to buy more services, they're going to buy more food. The problem is that people didn't buy more services and didn't buy more food. Right? They cut their spending for everything. So then you get a third story, which is by somebody else you know, which is about avoiding default on installment contracts. So this story is that what's new in the 1920s is the ability of families to buy durable goods with an installment contract. You go into the car dealer, you put 30% down, you sign a piece of paper, you take 12 or 18 months to pay off this car over time. If you miss a payment, the repo man comes and repossesses the car, right? They come, they take the car, you take it down, they sell the car. Now, suppose that you have $400 left to pay on your contract, and they sell the car for $600. Who gets those $200? Well, in the early 1930s, the car dealer got to keep that surplus. The laws were still reflecting an earlier time when the use of installment credit had been in and of itself an indicator that this was a family that couldn't budget their money very well. So the installment plans and the laws were all set up in a time when not very many people used the installment plan, when those who did were folks who couldn't save and who didn't budget their money well. And so there was a prima facie assumption that if you were borrowing on installments, you were likely to default. And therefore, it was going to be really expensive to you, and there was going to be a little bonus at the end of the game for the dealer. If you defaulted, they'd come, they'd repossess, they'd resell it, and oftentimes there would be a surplus because these repossessions that happened were happening very early in the contract. You had 30% down, and so it's not like today when you drive the car off the lot and it's worth like so much thousands less than what you paid for it, and how much you owe is always more than what the car is worth. 30% down payment, that story that we all know from experience doesn't apply. Those cars are worth more than what you still owe on the contract. So what does this mean? It means it's very expensive for you to miss payments on your car. And so if you have a loss of income, or if you simply fear that in the future you might have a loss of income, you're going to cut back any place you can in order to make those car payments. You're thinking, oh my God, my job right now, I'm okay, but I just got a letter from my cousin and they just had 10% wage cuts. Or did you hear from Charlie down the street? Their factory's starting to lay people off. And so you're thinking, you know, if that happens to us, we could lose the car. And if we lose the car, how am I going to get another job? And so we cut back everywhere. We're not going to the malt shop anymore. So here you bring in your family choices examples again, right? We're not going to the malt shop anymore. We're doing this, we're doing that. We're cutting back every place we can in order to make the payments on the car. What would the evidence be that would support the story? One piece of evidence would be decreases in consumption in all the categories. Check. Got that. The other piece of evidence would be really low default rates and repossession rates, and check, we get that too. So the default rate and the repossession rate in 1932, 1933, at the worst of the Great Depression, is much lower than it is actually later, 37, 38, by which time the laws have all been changed so that you keep the surplus instead of giving up the surplus. So that's my story.